Welcome to the Watercolor Experiments demonstration. To get started, you will need a Watercolor Experiments worksheet or a piece of watercolor paper. You will need some watercolor brushes of various sizes, a cup of water for cleaning your brushes, a paint palette for mixing and activating your watercolor. You will need tape for a resist and salt for a resist. Make sure to have some paper towels nearby. Erasers, a crayon or pastel for a wax resist, a sponge or something to stamp with, rubbing alcohol to use as a resist, and your watercolor paint. Let's get started. We are going to start with a salt resist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay down a wash of color. Remember, watercolor is full of surprises, so it's important to experiment and see what it's capable of. Do not let the paint dry. You want to work with it while it's still wet. Add salt and let it dry. Next is rubbing alcohol resist. I am going to start with a wash of color again. This time I'm going to play with wet into wet. Remember, that is when one color bleeds into another. While the paint is still wet, take some rubbing alcohol and try dripping it into the watercolor. Notice how the paint reacts. Next, let's try lifting. Again, I'm going to start with a wash of color. While the paint is still wet, I am going to take a clean brush and try to draw into the paint. My paper is not allowing me to pick up too much paint, but I'm going to go ahead and let this dry. Masking. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use masking tape as a resist. There are several approaches you can do, but I'm going to start by putting down some masking tape and get creative with the design. Once you are happy with where the tape is, we're going to go ahead and add a wash on top. Let the paint dry before removing the tape. Splattering. Load up your paintbrush with some paint and try to flick some of the paint onto the surface. You can try tapping the brush or moving the bristles back. Eraser. Start by applying a wash of watercolor. Again, I am doing wet into wet, a color blend. Let that dry. Stamping. Now you can use various tools to use for stamping. Here I'm using a sponge. You want to make sure this sponge is damp. Dip it into some watercolor and try to stamp with it. Wax resist. For the wax resist, I am starting with a wash of watercolor as my background, and then I'm going to let that dry. And for the last box, it is your free choice. There are so many different things you can do with watercolor. Be sure to try something new. I did a brush stroke of watercolor. Then, while it's still wet, I am spraying it with water. And then I decided to add more pigment to it. And once you're happy with it, let that dry. Okay, my entire worksheet is now dry. I am going to start by removing some masking tape. What you'll see is that my paper is white. Now I could have put down a wash first, then did masking tape, then did a wash on top. Different approaches give you different results. The tape resisted the paint. My lifting wasn't very successful, so I'm going to try to go back in with a wet brush and see if I can pull up some of this paint. It slightly came up. Let's try erasing on top of watercolor. I was able to get very little up. Wax resist. I'm applying a pastel on top of my wash. Then I am going to add another layer of wash on top of that. And what you will see is that the wax is resisting the paint. Let that dry. Once everything is dry, go ahead and remove the salt from the first box. And just like that, we are all done. If you like this video, please check out our watercolor techniques video. The link is in the comments. Thank you for watching, and happy painting!